Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Ethiopia has inaugurated a giant dam on the Nile River, a huge feat of engineering that the region hopes will address chronic energy shortages.
The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is not merely a national project. It is a Pan-African statement. It exemplifies the scale and ambition of African-led infrastructure.
But the dam could spark further tensions with Egypt and Sudan, who remain locked in a dispute with Ethiopia over management of the river that provides fresh water to more than 100 million people.
Ethiopia built the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam to bring prosperity, light up the region, and change the history of black people, not to harm any of our neighbours.
On today's episode of the Next Africa podcast, we'll look at what this dam might achieve for the region and how Ethiopia's dispute with its neighbours could play out. I'm Jennifer Zabasajja, and this is the Next Africa podcast, bringing you one story each week from the continent, driving the future of global growth with the context only Bloomberg can provide. Before we get to our conversation this week, our Ethiopia correspondent, Fasika Tadesse, was at the inauguration ceremony earlier this week. Here's part of what she saw.
The dam stands about 145 meters high and close to 1,800 meters long, featuring a concrete gravity dam design. The main and the saddle dams have been finished, and the installation of the 13 turbines is completed and now operational, generating a little over 5,000 megawatt of energy. The reservoir has also captured 74 billion cubic meters of water, creating an artificial lake, and I see that the spillways are releasing water, allowing to flow downwards.
Fasika is joining me now, along with Tarek El-Tablaway from our Cairo bureau. Thank you both for being here. Fasika, let's just start with you. We heard your description there of just how big this dam is. Maybe you can tell us a bit about the project and just how long it's been in development.
The construction of the dam was started in 2011 with the hope of finishing it in 5 years, but it has been delayed due to various reasons, including diplomatic tensions between downstream countries, Sudan and Egypt, and also the mismanagement by the previous company that was overseeing the project, and also funding issues because none of the international lenders were not willing to fund the project. So that were the major reasons that led the project to be delayed for more years than the expected 5 years.
So clearly, it's been quite a long path for the government to actually get this up and running. So it makes sense why this was a significant day for them. What did they say on the day about some of their ambitions for what this dam will do and also what the economic impact of the dam will be?
It was portrayed by the Prime Minister and also by the government officials who were in attendance at the inauguration. Was the inauguration of the dam is a history for Ethiopia, having the largest African dam at the same time, financing it or building a $5 billion dam through domestic financing. So it was a big day for the country. When it comes to the economic impact, the first one is half of Ethiopia's population live without access to power. So that's the first thing the dam will be doing in giving power to the community. And also the industrialization. So last year, the Ethiopia's industry sector grew by 10%. So the government hopes to fill those growing demand from the power generated from the new dam. And also the Prime Minister said it could generate up to $1 billion on a yearly basis from exporting power to neighboring countries. So far, Ethiopia exports power to Djibouti, Kenya, and Tanzania. That's the target. And also recently, Ethiopia starts bringing in Bitcoin mining companies that are using power generated from the dam. So that's also the expectation the government hopes to achieve through the recently inaugurated dam.
And Fasika, you talked a bit about this, but there's clearly been a lot of disputes on the way to this inauguration, to this unveiling of the dam. And a lot of that is centered around the Nile and the countries that are along its path. What have the discussions been with some of the countries along the Nile and Ethiopia?
Yeah, since 2015, the three countries have been Sudan, Ethiopia, and Egypt have been in negotiation on how to operate the dam. The negotiation started before the dam was finished, and part of the discussion was how to operate or how to manage the operation of the dam, especially the minimum guaranteed water flow that downstream countries will be getting from Ethiopia, especially during drought season. There had been discussions between the three countries and several rounds of discussions, including US-mediated conversations and negotiations, but all of them didn't materialize and the three countries didn't reach to an agreement. So I would say the process has stalled for the couple of years.
Which leads me to Tarek. Thanks so much for being here. You are in Egypt. Maybe you can give us a bit of history about the significance of the Nile for Egypt before we get into some of the events of this week.
It's obviously hugely significant. I mean, Egypt relies on the Nile water for, essentially 98% of its water needs. There's a saying in Egypt that whoever drinks from the Nile will always come back. I mean, that's kind of the mantra in the country. So the idea that, there's the potential for shortfall for Egypt, which is to an extent, it's already experiencing that, is hugely significant. I mean, as the presidency put it yesterday when they issued a statement in response to the inauguration, they deemed it an existential issue. It's really a question of life or death for a country that essentially relies on the Nile water for almost everything.
You mentioned the statement that we got from the presidency. Has the messaging changed from Egypt over the years, or does it remain consistent, their concerns with this dam?
Obviously the statements are all couched in diplomatic language. The most recent statement, which basically relayed a message or a letter that was submitted to the Security Council, talked about how Egypt retains its rights to respond according to international law and the UN Charter. And it, came out fairly forcefully against Ethiopia and what it dubbed the intransigence on the part of the government there to effectively or actively engage in negotiations that would yield to an agreement that would more fairly or equitably distribute the Nile water among the Nile Basin countries.
I want us to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk a bit more about Egypt and potentially what the next steps could be, and even bringing in Sudan. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Today on the podcast, we're talking about the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which hopes to provide some 5,000 megawatts of energy to the Horn of Africa region. Fasika, Tadesse, and Tarek El-Tablaway are still with me. Tarek, I wanted to stick with you because you were talking about potentially discussions that could happen moving forward. What's been interesting has been Egypt and Sudan sort of banding together against the dam. Do we have any sense of what the next steps look like for these two countries and their discussions or lack thereof with Ethiopia?
I think the focus right now on the part of Egypt and ostensibly also Sudan is really to pursue the diplomatic channels that are available to the international efforts. I mean, as I mentioned, they've taken the issue, presented it to the Security Council in the hopes, obviously, that perhaps the Council would convene a special session to discuss it. Behind that, what we've been seeing on the part of Egypt is really a much stronger or much more active engagement on its part with its African neighbors, especially the Horn of Africa. And in essence, I mean, what they're trying to do is to draw in those countries that were previously aligned with Ethiopia, more on their side. I mean, Egypt had a long history in Africa under Gamal Abdel Nasser back in the 50s and 60s, was very actively engaged. And then that they really withdrew from that scene, under Sadat and then subsequently Mubarak. And I think they've realized that was a mistake, in the sense that it opened the door for Ethiopia to start rallying or building alliances or exerting its own influence there at the expense of Egypt. So, he's stepping back into the game a bit later, starting maybe in 2019 is when they really actively done some kind of outreach with countries like Eritrea, Somalia. Last month, the Ugandan president was in Cairo meeting with President Sisi, and a big part of their talks focused on the Nile. And obviously Egypt's hopes that Uganda would kind of press the issue between us, before a 7-member committee that would look into trying to find a way to pressure or to convince Ethiopia to step back in with some kind of serious proposal that would mitigate the potential impact, should another significant drought arise. I mean, that's really the Egyptian concern, is what would happen if you have an extended drought season or drought period for several years. It has tremendous domestic political significance. I mean, the fact that Egypt hasn't been able to broker or reach an agreement with Ethiopia is problematic for the government, because it affects a nation of about 108 million people. Then you factor in another 10 million people that are refugees from various conflicts in the region, who are basically dealing with a severe water shortage, for lack of a better word. I mean, Egypt's under the UN guidelines. I mean, Egypt is a water poor country. It's the average per capita is about 500 meters compared to what it was back when the initial agreements were signed back decades ago.
I think you're alluding to the agreements made from Britain, right? Allotting Egypt part of the Nile River. How much weight do you think that will potentially carry in these diplomatic discussions?
I think what Egypt is looking for, per se, is something that allows them more equitable access to the water in proportion to the country's domestic needs. The Egyptian government, the presidency, has all along maintained that Ethiopia has a right to economic development. It's everybody's right. But at the same time, that shouldn't come at the expense of another country which is in a serious bind. I mean, it's not something you can make up for through desalination plants or even upgrading technology or recycling water, especially when the country's Egypt is trying to, increase agricultural land, boost arable area to lessen its reliance on imports.
And I'd like to bring Fasika back into this. Fasika, how has the Ethiopian government responded to these latest legal threats? Because as we mentioned, this has been going on for quite some time.
There is no direct response for the legal threat, but the government has been justifying that the dam wouldn't have an impact on Sudan and Egypt, saying that the dam has reached in its full capacity. The reservoir is full now, and there is no big impact that has created on Egypt and Sudan. That's the justification coming from the government. The government also says that catching that amount of water prevented Sudan from the recurring floods happening in the country. So that's the justification coming from the government. But also during the inauguration ceremony, the Prime Minister was saying Ethiopia doesn't have an intention to harm both countries, and the country has a responsibility to protect those countries from any kind of disasters or challenge they might face.
And let's just finish on the inauguration. There was quite an A-list of attendees there, heads of state from across East Africa at the specific inauguration. Just to Tarek's point earlier, it's seeming like Ethiopia is getting a few allies to get on board with them with the benefits, I guess, of this dam. But did we hear anything specifically from some of these heads of state about the various claims about the Nile River?
4 heads of state were there during the inauguration, and all of them delivered speech during the inauguration ceremony. And one of the 3 things they mentioned was cooperation between the downstream countries and ensuring regional stability in the Horn of Africa. And yes, obviously, that was one of the reasons stressed by Kenya's President William Ruto and also the Somalian president. The other point they have mentioned was benefit the East African countries will be getting from the dam. So all of them expressed interest to purchase power from Ethiopia in the coming years. So, yes.
And you can read our coverage of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam across Bloomberg platforms now. Here's some of the other stories we've been following across the region this week. Prosecutors at the International Criminal Court began presenting evidence this week to support their charges against fugitive Ugandan rebel leader Joseph Kony at the global court's first ever absentia hearing, alleging that he inflicted horrors on Ugandan society that still echo 2 decades later. And Nigeria's currency unit, the Naira, has rallied the most in Africa this month. It's been driven by high nominal rates and investor positioning ahead of expectations that the central bank may start cutting rates as inflation continues to trend downwards in the West African nation. You can follow these stories across Bloomberg, including the Next Africa newsletter. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. This program was produced by Adrian Bradley and Tiwa Adebayo. Don't forget to follow and review the show wherever you usually get your podcasts. But for now, I'm Jennifer Zabasajja. Thanks for listening.